Regular viewers are going to recognize my next guest. He's returning for, I think this is the fourth week in a row, Patrick Bergy. How are you, Patrick?
Fine, thank you, Jason.
Thanks for joining me again this morning. Very pleased to have you with us. People are going to remember, Patrick, that you were a private first class at the age of 40 in the U.S. Army. You are an IT expert, an IIA expert, and you are now a victim of the swamp, a legitimate whistleblower who has been trying for some time to get his information to the right Congress people, the right law enforcement people, and like every other legitimate whistleblower that I know, you've been minimized, you've been kept from the goal, and we're trying to help you get that information to the proper authorities. People can go to victimoftheswamp.com to read all about you. And you also have recently created a Patreon page that people can go to. They can visit patreon.com/theshadownet and they can sponsor you on a monthly basis. They can also dig into some of your research about how a South Korean woman was charged with manslaughter and all the kind of hacking information you get into. You call yourself the ShadowNet hacker because you were working as a contractor for Dynology, the company that created ShadowNet and now has commercialized it as Clear Force. So I've asked you to join us today, Patrick, sort of as an expert witness, somebody who knows much more about this type of stuff in general than I do, and I wanted to try to find some answers to questions about this system known as the HAMR, H-A-M-R. There's been a ton of reporting about this thing, and it just seems like so many people who are talking about it don't know a damn thing about it. So I wanted to pose some questions to you. I sent you the videos that I've done with Kevin Shipp, with Mike Zullo, with Mary Fanning, sent you some links that we've found. What have you determined over the past few days in general about this?
Well, I suppose there are aspects of it that make complete sense to me, right? The way that I would expect and have seen things happen in our government as it relates to its relationship with the military-industrial complex, right? So it's very typical, as you've seen with the ShadowNet, for a taxpayer-funded DoD weapon to be made commercially available after the contract is over. Right, so the initial contract, a retired general or even active duty general or anybody could get a contract like this, work it, let's say, for a year. They lose the contract in a rebid. When they leave, though, they keep the intellectual property rights for what they develop. And it's so to that extent, then taking these applications and making them commercially available to the highest bidder now, not the lowest necessarily, right, is very much commonplace, right? So where they go into the HAMR and say, okay, well, you know, some of that does make sense. The discussions about it going from a defense contract to a commercial application that could be stored on servers anywhere, right? Because once the military-industrial complex gets hold of it, you don't have the same rules, regulations that you have to follow, that the government has to follow, right?
So a contractor to the military can often introduce a lot of flexibility and capability that the military might be restricted from by law or checks and balances or whatever. We've heard about this a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. The checks and balances are actually pretty heavy when it comes to, and very good. I encourage it. It does make someone like me, it makes their job a little harder, right? But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you don't want someone like me to actually just be able to do anything that he wants. Probably that's, hey, this is a great idea. Well, you know, other people look it over and say, yeah, it would probably work really well, but we got some serious problems over here. So these are good checks and balances, right? Mm-hmm. Once you've pulled that out of the government, you've made it commercially available. Many, if not all of those laws are not going to apply, or at least not apply in the same way, right? So you can then act on those. Now, this has been going on ever since what was it, Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech, right? So that's nothing new. It's not a new debate. But what is new is the potential and the ease of access that social networks of all varieties have given these technologies, right? So yeah, you know, we invent the nuclear bomb. Well, the nuclear bomb is, even if you have the instructions, is still going to be really hard to make, right?
And deploy,
not just anybody
and store,
can do it.
and all that.
And yeah, right. And you know, so yeah, these are dangerous
It's a big
technologies.
operation.
But just using common off-the-shelf tools like we did developing what later became the ShadowNet is completely, you know, you can take that and adapt it into today's technologies and have tremendous abilities to do covert or overt influence operations, right? And they are just going nuts with this. It's a whole new cottage industry now, and most of the businesses that are doing this started these technologies, just like I said, at taxpayer expense, right? But when you get into the HAMR, which is which is what you put out today in the information that you sent me, things don't really add up beyond that to me, right? So,
what do you mean? What things don't add up?
One article that you sent me, and I don't have it up in front of me here, but one article that you sent me that was written by Mary Fanning and Alex Jones, or
Alan Jones, yeah.
Alan Jones. One of those articles specified some of the capabilities of HAMR, right? Which largely described the HAMR by them as more of a database, right? Whereas, and it also described other things like, I'm killing myself pulling this up, but trying to remember it, but it was...
She said it was a browser exploit throwing platform.
Well, it is. That's one of the things. And on that same page, in that same article, it also it said that it could access even classified networks, right? So I wish you know, if I could pull that up. It said that, you know, very specifically that it had access to classified networks, or the ability to access those, right? And the way it suggested it would be like it had the ability to access data from FISA, from the FISA court, right? Would that be accurate, Jason?
I would love to have that
one of the claims,
article. I believe that is. I believe that is.
One of the claims that they make is that they had the ability to access FISA data. Well, FISA data is actually going to be stored on a highly encrypted network, right? So the HAMR, based on what they're talking about, is more like a predictive modeling thing, right? And that's what the HAMR Technologies is. HAMR Technologies is predictive modeling.
Well, let me take you a step back for a second, Patrick, because I think that you've got a ton of information about this now in that big brain of yours, and some people might be a bit confused. So I want to remind everyone that one of the things that I identified, and we should say there are a lot of different technologies that use this acronym HAMR. Seagate has a hard drive technology where they apply heat to the platter to make storing more magnetic bits on there possible. Heat-activated magnetic resonance or something like that. And Harvard has the Harvard Ambulatory Mechanical Robot. So just having the name HAMR does not cause me to assume that this must be the thing that Dennis Montgomery was talking about or that WikiLeaks was talking about. But there are some interesting things about this product HAMR produced by a company that used to be called HAMR Tech that caught my interest. This thing claims to be a big data analytics tool, and as I looked through this video, correct me if this statement is wrong, Patrick, it seems like a development environment of some kind where you can create databases or collections of data that you do various operations to, and it's a highly customizable platform that could be used for a variety of things.
This would be that database, or that company that you're looking at there, would be their closest competitor would probably be IBM SPSS, right? So I was an SPSS manager, or admin, right? Very low tier 1 level, but nonetheless, right? So what that is basically predictive algorithms, right? So it's using AI to create predictive algorithms. So if I was going to if I wanted to have a predictive, get 3 quotes from predictive algorithm companies, right? I'd probably reach out to ClearForce, I'd reach out to those guys, and I would reach out to IBM with their SPSS, right?
Watson.
So, not Watson. No. Well, yeah, okay, yeah. SPSS is using Watson now, right?
Yeah.
So, absolutely, right. My time with SPSS was 2010 or so, right? So, they've made big advancements on it. They actually bought SPSS from a standalone company, which I would actually suspect may have been something that was originally a HAMR type of defense contract, right? And then became SPSS, and then that. One of the big problems I have with naming a company HAMR, if it was ever related to the people who did create a DoD contract that had a secret classification of HAMR for a code name, you would never, for 25 years, you wouldn't be able to use that code name as it related to that product in any way, shape, or form. So that's one problem. Second problem is the article where they make the claims about the HAMR, is that they said that it was a classified project, right? So if it's a classified project, then you're not going to be able to use the name HAMR, and you're not going to be able to make that product commercially available, right? That was one of the big things. Dynology, the government wanted to make what was later called the ShadowNet. I'm never going to discuss what its actual code name was, right? The ShadowNet's the commercial name for it, but once you can't, once it's been put on a classified network, you can't use it, right? And the government wanted to put the ShadowNet on a classified network, but we literally came back to them with a price that was ridiculous and a bunch of BS explanations to get them to drop that, because we wanted to be able to keep the IP and make it commercially available.
Wow.
Right? So once it's on a classified network, and Mary's article stated that it was a classified program, HAMR, and stated that HAMR was the code name, the classified code name for that. Well, I have issues with someone with this leaving a classified environment, a classified network at any point in time, and becoming something that would be commercially available, right? So that's a big problem that I have. Now, there are other solutions out there that don't require this type of classified speculation. You got ClearForce, right? ClearForce absolutely does the same type of thing, does the same thing that HAMR does. It's at least what the HAMR website it does, the HAMR Tech.
Sorry, let me pause you, because
predictive modeling.
We're going a little bit askew. I want to make sure that people understand. We have not made the determination that HAMR Tech, this Hammerhead Shark, this company, HAMR, we have not made the determination that this is the same thing that Mary Fanning and Dennis Montgomery are talking about. In fact, there are a lot of reasons to believe that this is something totally different. The only reason I brought this to your attention, Patrick, is that it just seems so similar to what they're describing it's very curious to me that the name would be the same, and it seemed like something that we've got to run down to understand a little bit better, particularly given Mary's lack of knowledge in the IT world and her imprecise descriptions of things throughout the course of this. To also clarify another point, I don't believe she ever represented that it was breaking into encrypted FISA networks. The allegation being made is that it was used to spy on multiple echelons of government, including the FISA court. They had to sign off on every foreign surveillance operation using the HAMR, and those sources say that Montgomery claims that Brennan and Clapper used the super surveillance system that Montgomery designed to spy on federal judges, including the head of FISA. So that could be just spying on his iPhone or any kind of unencrypted thing, not necessarily the court itself. But, you know, again, the claim here is that this one guy in his garage built a super surveillance system that was so great that Brennan and Clapper, the heads of the CIA and all these agencies, went and hired this one guy to use his system. I mean, does that seem like something that happens?
Well, yeah, you know, I could see that happening, right? And I could see that, you know, the same thing was done with the ShadowNet, right? So
one guy created that?
DOD. Under one we developed it for the DOD.
I'm talking about one guy in his house developing this system.
Developing one guy in I thought the HAMR was originally like a project, right?
Well, we don't know. We don't know. We're getting information.
We do know a little bit. We do know a little bit, and I would dispute one thing you said is that she does list information that is very specific to the company, right? So you're looking up. Based on the article that she wrote, you're looking up HAMR analytic technologies, right? There are screenshots and other things that actually use that name, right?
Right.
So if you
not from
go
her
to
though,
HAMR,
anything with HAMR analytic technologies is from me. She's never spoken about the company. She just says Dennis Montgomery created this, sold it to the government. I found that company, HAMR Analytic Technologies, and it's led me to people like Rich Collier, who, according to his LinkedIn page, he was only ever the VP of software engineering, but when we look at other sources, it says he was the CEO. So I also find that weird that the guy would not want his resume to include the very impressive position of CEO. I've tried to reach Rich Collier for comment about HAMR Tech, HAMR Analytics, etc. He's now the vice president of engineering at a company called Life Image that I've been calling for days. I haven't been able to connect with him. I spoke with his wife yesterday. I found his home phone number, but he didn't call me back. He doesn't seem to want to talk about this.
Yeah, and I pulled that up on LinkedIn, but I have what you I have what I was looking for here right now.
You want to just send me the link on Twitter or something, and we'll show it?
It's the Mary. It's what you have up there. It's the Mary Fanning article, and the links down below actually have screenshots and such. Maybe it's another one here. Actually have screenshots
FBI
to
reports?
it. Center for Security Policy. No, there we go. I think this is one I was looking for. Bear with me one moment. It's an article that Mary Fanning published on CDN, Community Digital News, and in that it says Montgomery alleges. Here we are. So yeah, it's comdiginnews.com, but it's with Mary Fanning and HAMR.
June 8th. Is this it?
I believe so. Yes, right June 8th.
Okay,
right?
Great. We've got it.
And so that actually has more information, more specific, right? So it lists like connections, more specific connections, I believe, to the Vault 7.
Yep.
Exploits. Now, the Vault, what they describe in the Vault 7 exploits, which is what HAMR is, is a throwing platform. Now, a throwing platform would be a throwing platform would be more along the line of like Kali Linux. All right, Kali Linux is a version of Linux which is built to just basically manage and deploy hacking tools, right? And their applications, right? And add-ons. That's what is the description of the HAMR, right? So the HAMR would be very much, it's in it exactly what it says. It's a platform, a throwing platform for browser exploits. So all Kali Linux is a platform, a throwing platform.
But what
for
is throwing?
exploits.
What is throwing? What is it throwing?
It's just it's like a foundational platform that allows you to manage and administer all of the add-ons and such, the different exploits that you're running, the injection hacks, cracks for algorithms, all of those.
So let's say
exactly.
I'm a federal judge. I'm a federal judge sitting here in my house. I'm on the iPad. I'm on the laptop. I'm on the phone. You're a guy working with HAMR. You want to hit me. You want to get my information. So you're using HAMR, and what? You're sending me an email with it? You're finding my IP address with it? What does it do? How does it work?
HAMR is a throwing platform for browser exploits, which is the exact definition they give, would be the platform to which you could select whatever browser exploit that you wanted to use for the particular job and execute those exploits. From like Kali Linux would do the same thing, right?
So if somebody says, hey, we've determined that this federal judge is using iPhone iOS 10, and we know that if he has Chrome on iOS 10, you can go to this web page and that'll allow you to access his entire contacts list and download it from his phone. Is that an exploit? Someone has...
Yeah. And to be more specific, the Vault 7 actually lists it as largely an iOS exploit, but they also have limited information showing that there were also add-on plugins that you could use for Android, right?
So they're saying it's Wild Turkey, HAMR testing with Wild Turkey, and they're saying that Wild Turkey is a name of iOS plugins. So if I've got this HAMR platform and you're a developer and you say, hey, HAMR user, do you want to hit people who have iPhones? I've developed with this development environment a suite of plugins that lets you target iOS, and I've got a separate suite of plugins that lets you target Android, and a separate suite of plugins that lets you target Mac OS and Windows 7 and Windows 9 and Windows 10. So those are plugins to the environment, something I might develop with this.
Sure. Yes. Pull up Kali Linux. Just Google Kali Linux, and the first thing you'll grab, that's exactly what Kali Linux does, right? There's I haven't seen it in years. There's a like an HBO or Showtime thing called Mr. Robot. Have you ever seen that?
I've heard of it.
Mr. Robot, the main character in that uses Kali Linux, and in fact, it's a penetration. It's designated as a penetration testing tool. So white hat hackers use Kali Linux to test for vulnerabilities on a network using the same tools that a black hat hacker would use to exploit those vulnerabilities and get onto your network. So it's a penetration testing tool. The same thing would be, you wouldn't call it a penetration testing tool, HAMR. You would it's just a penetration tool, right? So the HAMR is the same thing. Based on everything that I've seen, the HAMR provides the same type of services as Kali Linux, right?
And you mean this
Kali Linux
HAMR
is just bundled
from HAMR Tech, or the HAMR as described by WikiLeaks and Mary Fanning?
The HAMR as described by WikiLeaks.
Okay.
Would be what that throwing platform is, right?
Right.
And again, this is you're on Crowdsource the Truth, so people can hopefully people with tech backgrounds might hear what I'm saying. perhaps be able, they can correct me if I'm wrong with any of this. They can possibly expand on it, but I don't think I am. I think that's pretty much, it's very limited information as for what you're going to have for a browsing exploit throwing platform. But if you take the words for what they mean, well, that's basically all Kali Linux is. Now, Kali Linux is not SPSS. Kali Linux is not the website version of what's being described there. You would not be able to use the characterization for those two different things, right? Mm-hmm. So what Mary's describing in her article is HAMR being, and there is an article where I saw that it literally listed the HAMR, where it literally listed the HAMR as being related to HAMR Tech, which is now like a defunct site, but it's owned by the Chinese.
Well, but that's this. That's this company. That's this company that's now defunct.
So that company, what they're describing there is a predictive analytics company, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't give any it doesn't give any indication that they're actually using quantum technologies or anything. All it gives is that they're using AI, right? Which is a very powerful tool, and the more data that you can provide, the better. But you build with AI, you build what are called neural networks, the same termination you have for neural nets in your brain. And from those neural networks, you create if this then that scenarios that branch out millions and millions of times to be able to predictively determine actions of the data that you collected, right? So you could create predictive behavioral models based on social media, financial, and other things. You tie all that information together with an algorithm that's written with an AI algorithm that's written for like the brain platforms are, and you come up with incredibly predictive outcomes. Right? It's still a computer. You don't want to trust it so much, but you can get a lot from that, right? But those are two different things. So the ability to hack something isn't described in Mary's interview and discussions about that website, right?
But is Mary talking about that website? I know that, as far as I know, Mary's only talking about WikiLeaks.
Mary's talking about WikiLeaks, but she's interviewing another gentleman, right? What's that gentleman that
Alan
she interviewed?
Jones?
No, another one. No, the person that was interviewed about HAMR.
Dennis Montgomery.
Montgomery, yes, right? So Montgomery is describing alleged that U.S. government wiretapped 17 Trump businesses, including Trump Tower. Mm-hmm. All wiretaps were under the Obama administration. Although the suit does not identify the surveillance system by name, audio recordings released in 2015 by a United States court judge, blah, 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 identify a secret government surveillance system called the HAMR, allegedly used to spy on Trump. And Trump, 159 judges, including Supreme Court Justice John Roberts, and millions of other Americans. Now, the HAMR isn't designed as it's described in the exploit in WikiLeaks. That HAMR would not be designed to spy on millions of Americans, right? It would be designed to be able to breach the vulnerability, breach an exploit and access a network. Potentially, right? You could breach. Are they saying that they could hack? They could somehow hack Facebook's profile data, right? Mm-hmm. That would be one way that you could access, millions of people. But generally, an exploit like that's going to be very target specific, right? You want to access my computer to get information on me, you put that exploit in, right? And you use the HAMR and any of its plugins that would be most effective for that particular mission, right?
So perhaps a Facebook plugin that recognizes the API or something about Facebook, and you plug it into this tool, and now it sucks information out of Facebook.
Well, that would be difficult. It would be complicated, and we're going to go down a rabbit.
Okay, so forget that. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this question. So, as the HAMR is described in WikiLeaks and by Mary Fanning, would it have been a sophisticated hacking tool early on, or no?
What they're describing is more like a collection database where you're collecting all of this information, right? So maybe it's just a thing of words here that I'm missing, right? But okay, the ShadowNet had two components. It had the ShadowNet and the ISI, right? The ShadowNet was provided your anonymity, provided all of that. The ISI database managed profiles and things like that, right? You would go into other areas, which is called CNO, Computer Network Operations, which would handle things like if you had an operation that required the HAMR plugins to be able to exploit a vulnerability to allow you access to a network, right? But we're talking, if we're talking about a FISA court network, you're talking about more than 2,000-bit encryption, which even if you connected every single computer processor on the planet, excluding quantum technology, if you plugged everyone on the planet together and utilized their resources, it would still take you 1,000,000 years to break a 2,000 plus encryption algorithm, right?
So the notion that a dude in his garage with 24 blade servers is doing this is pretty far-fetched.
Well, yeah, it is because you've got multiple components. Is that one dude sitting there running exploits and then collecting a database and building an algorithm for the database that allows you to do everything that both the ShadowNet and ISI allowed you to do, but I don't hear of any discussion of like a separate components of it, right? So the HAMR, as described in the Vault 7, is an exploit tool, right? It is not a collection per se where you're going to collect and analyze the data, analytics, right? So you have those two components. Now, the other HAMR, as described on the website, actually would do that, right? So if you use the Vault 7 HAMR and exploited a vulnerability in a network, which isn't going to include networks that are after 2016 pretty much because they're all 2048-bit encryption and up.
What about in the early 2000s? He would have been doing this maybe before then.
Well, the encryptions are like 512 at that point. PKI encryptions are like 512 at that point, which wouldn't require, but it would still take thousands of years. And think about the fact that you didn't have as powerful computers back in 2008, 9, and 10 as you do now. So, yeah, the math still isn't there. It doesn't work.
Would this technology have allowed the user to hack into things like banks, phone companies?
Not after a certain time. Not when the industry standard went to, well, with the Windows 10 platform, the industry standard went to 2048, I believe, right?
So but before that, could he have used this garage system to hack into a bank?
Before that, could he have used the garage system?
Can't you just use one computer to hack into a bank?
Yeah.
Socially engineer somebody?
Absolutely, you could, right? Before that. And now you still could, based on all mathematical models that I've seen, if you start going into quantum entangled 50 qubit quantum systems, right? Those could hack up any type of
Well, but
encryption within seconds.
not quantum system. I'm talking about stuff that would be in somebody's garage.
Sure.
In this time
Sure.
frame, it would have been like Windows XP or something like that.
Exactly. I mean, it's not going to happen, right? So I caveat the fact that I say you couldn't do it with the fact, well, technically you probably could now, but not then, right? So you're going to be limited. And what good is it to be collecting data? There was like, I don't think it was Thin Thread. It was another one that where they did the
Trailblazer.
Trailblazer, is that where they were connecting to the fiber optics?
Yeah.
One of them
Prism.
where they were so they're connecting to fiber optics. Great. You're collecting plus 2048 encrypted data, right? So great, you've collected that. Now what are you going to do with it, right? Unless you got a quantum computer that's going to be able to give you that encrypted hash code, or unless you've done other things individually, like man in the middle. There are ways to get hash codes, right? There are ways to do that, but not on a large scale.
You hit a person and you might spend days on that person trying to socially engineer them, find their passwords, find their hash codes, de-encrypt their information.
Man in the middle, SQL injections, different things that you can use.
Spying on the person, listening to their phone calls? Or what do you mean by that? These terms are not necessarily understood. Man in the middle, let's say I work at the bank. Mm-hmm. You want to get into the bank. You're going to target me somehow, mm-hmm. right? They came in unencrypted, these files.
Sure. So how are you connecting to the bank? Are you using your cell phone? Well, if I've got a cell phone emulator, right, where I'm sitting in my car and all phone calls from that neighborhood, I forget what the name of it is. I'm horrible with that
Stingray.
stuff. But Stingray, right? And all phone calls from the neighborhood are coming through my Stingray device. Then I could do, or if I'm hacked into your Wi-Fi, right, whatever public or home Wi-Fi you're using, I could then intercept your traffic and perform a man-in-the-middle attack. And through, I could create through different fake MAC addresses, different things that I could do that could trick the bank that you're pulling your information from into thinking that I am the person that sent the request, right? You send the request, they respond back to me, I respond back that I am the person that you gave that request to, and now I've got the connection, and the actual bank person doesn't, right? That's one example of a man in the middle.
Right. Just to clarify,
there are many other
with
ways.
Thin Thread mm-hmm. is the declassified program that Bill Binney talks about. That would collect the data encrypted, and then the NSA had the ability to unencrypt it with a court order. So they had that technology.
It depends on the encryption data in order for me to believe that, right? If it's very low encrypted data,
But wouldn't the NSA have the ultimate
maybe
quantum computer, and Google has quantum supremacy and all that?
Nobody's ever suggested that. So that's why, if someone had suggested that, I would say, okay, then we become plausible again. But nobody suggested that, so I'd like one cybersecurity person to tell me that a 2048 or above encryption could be cracked by anything other than a quantum computer. And it's only theoretical with quantum, and that theoretical is based on the fact that we can now entangle 50 qubits. So theoretically, you could have done that. I think IBM engineers said when you got to 6 qubits, 6 entangled qubits, you could theoretically break any algorithm out there as far as encryption, right? That's one of the things that it does really well, and you could do it in seconds. But no one suggested that. No one suggested that here.
I think Bill Binney has said that.
Yeah, but the government didn't have. I've seen nothing to show that the government had any type of system of quantum capabilities that are going to be above 6 qubits entangled in 2010 even. 2012, 14. They're just now. Google is published publicly at 20 plus qubits now, maybe more. IBM's Q is at 50 quantum entangled qubits. So you're talking, they have the capability for doing that now. If you wrote the proper algorithm to have it do that. But none of these people have suggested that. It's a problem, right, Jason? I mean, even if you got to get right off the track with this, right? Exclude the HAMR stuff. Nothing on the planet is going to be secured once they get more than like six entangled qubits of processing power, and that's based on IBM's own engineers.
Wow.
And we're already close to 50. So it's a discussion we should probably have had about 44 qubits ago, if you ask me. And but no.
So is that what Google means when they say quantum supremacy? They have 53 qubits in this quantum computer?
Quantum supremacy is a different thing. That's the point at which quantum supremacy is the point at which quantum computers can do everything that a regular computer can do, only faster, right? And we have not reached quantum supremacy yet.
But I thought Google said they did.
Largely because, well, no, they didn't. It's largely because of the coding and such, not because of the hardware so much right now. Oh. But they cannot. Sure, it can do, their quantum systems can do a lot of things unimaginably faster than today's most powerful standard x86 like processors, right? But that's a big difference. That's a world of difference from being able to have those entangled qubits actually be able to do that, right? So actually be able to do it better than a regular computer. But they're never going to be exactly like regular computers either, right? A quantum computer it's not built for the same purpose. It's never going to be it's never going to be a Siri
laptop,
right?
Yeah.
It's never going to be a laptop. It's never going to be your Siri, but it could perhaps someday make your traffic almost perfectly, right? So you're driving through traffic and a quantum computer is calculating your routes faster than any, before your routes even happen. They know the light's going to change before the light even changes, right? And so they can start controlling patterns with that. But they haven't reached that yet. Right.
Okay.
So
let me reel you back into some of these questions about the HAMR, because there's a lot of things that we don't know. We're basically just looking at an unanswered question, someone with a lot of expertise trying to answer it. Do you think the HAMR technology that's described by Mary Fanning could be used to reach a computer system firewall and take over the computer as the administrator to retrieve data from the computer?
Based on what the WikiLeaks description is, absolutely. That's what it would be designed for.
Okay.
Right? So, yeah.
So,
absolutely.
And so, do you think that this WikiLeaks described HAMR is this all-powerful, super-secret government spying system that was used to spy? Have we seen any evidence that this must be the system? There's some marker, some technological marker that tells us that this WikiLeaks described HAMR, this browser exploit throwing platform with iOS plugins, this is the super secret spying system that's the key to all the Trump, Russia, and Michael Flynn and all the spying stuff? Do you see evidence that this is that?
I see evidence that it's capable of it, if true, right? Again, I kind of stay in my lane. I don't know what's true or not when it comes to HAMR with what these people have testified to, right? I do know what's true in my scenario as it relates to ShadowNet, ISI, and the way the government works, the way the military-industrial complex works. So there's a lot of things that I find to be plausible. But then there are other things that I have difficulty with the plausibility of. And then there are other things that I say, well, why would you need to go to all that trouble of using the HAMR or doing what he was doing when you could just use a setup like ClearForce or a company like Dynalogy that has contracts with CKMS, the Congressional Knowledge Management System, which actually has access to all of Congress's content management and knowledge management. I would suspect they and at ClearForce's website and Dynalogy's website, they have contracts for NSA databases, right? So they have, this company literally has access to all these databases, and they don't even need to hack them.
Huh.
And
so when did this come out? When was this technology available? It sounds like you're saying that something like this could have just as easily been used.
Yeah, why would you need to hack it when these guys actually have the contract for it, for all the data?
Well, because they want to keep it secret.
And this was, well, it is secret. It's a company that it's the military-industrial complex company. It's not the government. It's a private company operating a government contract, right? Mm-hmm. So, do you trust a private company who has access to NSA databases or potentially even FISA databases? Do you trust that they're just naturally not going to let their other systems or networks access it through their predictive behavioral models? I don't see any reason to believe that they would do that for a second, right?
Right.
That's their modus operandi. So we already know if they have these contracts. We already know they have access.
And let me ask you this, Patrick. Sorry to interrupt, but let's say you were, hypothetically speaking, somebody like General Michael Hayden, and you're on the board of directors of ClearForce, and let's say you devised some scheme to spy on people using this ClearForce technology, and perhaps that scheme was outside of the scope of the work that you're contracted for. Do you think, given that hypothetical situation, you might be motivated to create a social engineering campaign that would prevent people from looking into ClearForce and cause them to think that this other system had to be the system that was used?
That's like, you mean like false flags? Well,
I mean, directing people away from, what I'm getting at is, it sounds to me like you're saying there is no conclusive evidence that the HAMR was the system that was used for any kind of secret surveillance or spying, because there could have been a lot of other systems that would be used, and we're looking for that piece of evidence that causes us to say, aha, this piece of evidence indicates that it had to be the HAMR. Dennis Montgomery's revelations of this HAMR are important to the Spygate, Ukrainegate thing, because look at this piece of evidence that leads. Because you've said on previous shows that you think that Dynalogy and ClearForce were critical to understanding Spygate and Ukrainegate, didn't you?
Yeah, and we have direct connections and direct ties and physical evidence and contracts that all show that. If HAMR broke into a database to get information that was used against Trump, most likely one of those databases would have included CKMS, which is all the Congressional Content Management, Knowledge Management. So Brennan, who worked with Jones, worked with Hayden in the Obama administration, is he going to reinvent the wheel, or is he going to call up his friends over at ClearForce and say, hey, you guys got these contracts over here. We need some dirt on some of these people. Let's keep it on the down low because we're just all a small team and a small family-owned company, and nobody's going to have, and we don't have the oversight, right? Or are you going to just try to hack into use a system like HAMR to hack into these things, right? So, right. I mean, like, what would you do? The Brennan, they're all friends, they're all the same, but Dynalogy has all these contracts, and that's provable. Go to the CKMS contract awards, right? So, I don't know. I don't know what's involved with HAMR. I do know what's involved with these things. And HAMR and ClearForce is the same damn thing as far as you're describing it. As far as the capabilities of it, I would actually say HAMR is actually a combination of ClearForce and the ShadowNet, because the HAMR, if you assume that it's also going to have analytical capabilities to process data, then you're also going to have to assume that it had the ability to that it had that ability along with the ability of being able to access the data through malware or different tools like that, which are described in the WikiLeaks HAMR version.
Right.
So all those things being equal, well, that was the ShadowNet and ISI. So why are you reinventing the wheel? You've got it right here. And the same players, the same people that built ShadowNet and ISI, use components of ShadowNet and ISI, Hayden and Jones, to create ClearForce. And ClearForce already has access to many of these contracts and most of this data. So why are you? So I mean, great.
So it seems less logical to you. Seems less logical from what I'm hearing. It sounds like it seems less logical to you that this one guy in a garage with a system he claims to have built called HAMR would have done this, and more logical that they would have used their well-established Dynology, or there sounds like there's other tools out there as well that could do the same thing.
Yeah, with built-in anonymity, non-attribution capabilities that you have inherent to the ShadowNet and ISI, which are inherent. Even that covert, overt capabilities are listed on ClearForce's website, right? So, I mean, no, everything's already there, and this is the company owned and built and run by Obama's former national security advisor, Obama's director of CIA, all of which are good friends with Bremer.
Brennan.
And you could Brennan, and you could easily do this in a 100% non-attributable way. Perhaps you could use some of the tools from like Vault 7, like HAMR, right? But I again, are you saying that guy developed HAMR on a series of 7 to 9 servers, and it's the same HAMR that was described in the WikiLeaks?
I believe that's the claim, that Dennis Montgomery developed this system, and the system is real because it's verified in WikiLeaks, and Dennis is a whistleblower because he came forward and told them, hey, this super secret system is being used to spy on people, and they want him to be seen as somebody on the level of like an Edward Snowden, a Bill Binney, this patriotic, heroic whistleblower who's looking out for everybody's best interest. Mary had put out a tweet not very long ago where she describes Montgomery as the real whistleblower, and that's a tweet that was retweeted by some very prominent people. And I mean, again, I don't know what's true or not true about this. There have been a number of things that Mary Fanning has said that cause me to believe that she has a problem with understanding facts and relaying them in a factual manner. I've asked her certain...
stuff gets complicated.
It is complicated.
And you have an IT background, and I have an IT background, right?
Right. And she doesn't, but she claims to know how to explain this. And when I've questioned her about certain pointed questions that seem not well answered, I don't get good answers. So I will state the question again. And it's also, I think it's important for people to know, Patrick, as far as this being like a cross-examination of a witness, from the standpoint of being a lawyer, I've done a bad job because I didn't know what your answers were going to be. I didn't prompt you with, correct? I didn't prompt you with any of these answers. You've even said things that kind of contradict what I was thinking, and that's fine. I wanted your honest answer.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Yeah, that's 100% truthful.
Okay.
We didn't really, we discussed this a little bit the other day, but that kind of, you asked me a couple questions, right, and said, hey, can you look into this?
Right.
And as I looked into it, I see how it could potentially be something that could be used, but then it actually raises a lot of questions. As I described earlier, it doesn't mean that, a relationship, a prime sub relationship didn't exist, right? So you would have, because I don't believe that the HAMR, as described by the gentleman that released the information,
Montgomery.
Montgomery, I don't I don't believe he's describing that as like an algorithmic database like SPSS, like IBM's SPSS, where you're going to be able to take all the data that you would exfiltrate or access either legally or illegally. What are you going to do with that data, right? How are you going to search it, query it? How are you going to use it, right? I don't think he's describing that on the servers that he set up. I think he's describing like what the WikiLeaks information was, right? Where it's basically a hacking tool, a platform, much like. And I'd be curious to see what he had to say about that. If I was accurate with that, if it's pretty much like I'm assuming it's like a Kali Linux platform, which is built to fire up your Kali Linux application, log in, and the whole thing is built for using hacking exploitable tools.
Yeah,
right?
I don't think we're going to get a chance to speak to him, but in the last couple minutes that we have, Patrick, I just want to take you back to this question, because the essential claim being made on the American Report by Mary Fanning is that Dennis Montgomery is the real whistleblower. The HAMR and the hard drives that he's presented to the FBI, despite having no FBI agent signature on the evidence receipt, she's claiming that these hard drives are evidence that validate his story, and that he has described the wiretapping that Clapper and Brennan were involved in. No mention of Michael Hayden. So it seems to me, if Michael Hayden and Jim Jones were working with Barack Obama or anyone to spy on Trump, they would have a definite interest in causing people to believe it was somebody and some tool other than them.
Sure, false flags. And that's a component built into the ShadowNet, being able to create false flags.
So do you believe
leaving
Mary Fanning's story
problems.
that this garage HAMR and this HAMR system used by Brennan and Clapper allegedly, do you believe her that it is definitively the truth that this is the system that was used to spy on Flynn and Trump? Or do you believe that there exists a strong possibility that some other system may have been used and that Dennis Montgomery and Mary Fanning are merely trying to be in the spotlight because this is big national news?
Well, you brought up the hard drives, right? Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a law firm that helped defend Montgomery, right?
Yes.
And that law firm, correct me if I'm wrong, they got sort of an immunity for him to mention certain aspects of HAMR, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Right. So I don't know what immunities that they would have given, but you're looking at like receipts without signatures to them.
Yeah.
If you turn in a drive, if you have a drive that you kept by accident and you no longer have a clearance, and you go, oh crap, I got this drive, I got to turn this in, right?
Yes.
When you turn that in, even though you don't have a clearance anymore, you will sign a paper. This is standard information assurance security regulation. You'll sign a paper that states you're not going to discuss any of the fact that you've just handed these drives over, anything on the drives, that they ever existed, anything, and you're going to sign a paper that says that under penalty of federal law, like 10 years in prison.
Well, he had a stroke, so he couldn't sign, and the allegation is that FBI agents signed these documents on his behalf. I find it strange that there'd be no indication of that here, and I find it even more strange that the same FBI agent who did that did not sign their own signature in the received by field right here. Mm-hmm.
And perhaps that's one of the exemptions that the FBI gave him, or whatever. But There's nothing to indicate that.
Right.
And I do know that if you turn in drives, even if you no longer have a clearance, and they had classified information on them, you're going to be required to sign a document that states that I'm not going to discuss that I ever even turn these drives in.
So you find it problematic that that's been discussed?
I find it problematic that's been discussed. Absolutely. I find it problematic that an actual classified code name is being discussed.
Does that reduce the credibility of the story for you?
It increases the amount of jail time that you're almost assured of getting. Code name that the ShadowNet is not a code name. Exactly. I don't know if the immunity applied to that, and I could hardly imagine it doing so, but I don't know. But no, I mean, those are really tightly held things, and you go to jail if you release that information publicly.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, this HAMR, as described by Montgomery, was apparently a breaching tool that could penetrate firewalls and remain in the system undetected for up to an hour and a half and take over administrator and download anything in the computer.
And that's exactly what the Kali Linux is designed to do. It just
so the
manages
WikiLeaks
all
description, that sounds right.
Yeah, the WikiLeaks description of what the HAMR would be as that throwing platform for browser exploits is exactly what that would be. It's basically
if you
a Kali
were Clapper
Linux.
and Brennan and you were doing a spying operation on Donald Trump, would you use 10-year-old technology? Do you think it could be that effective?
Well, one thing that I would argue, right? Okay, so let's look at, and this is a good point I think you'll like, right? So let's look at attribution, right? That's a big thing with me. So if you had the HAMR, right, which was, and if the HAMR was in fact like a Kali Linux box that basically allowed you to manage all of these exploits, the plugin exploits for used for hacking, right? Well, what was Vault 7? Vault 7 was released, were all of these hacking exploits released, right? So if the CIA were the only ones that owned all of these things, and they were used by someone like Montgomery, you would know it, right? And there would be attribution because the only people that would have access to this would be the CIA, or would be the people that were involved with the CIA in building out these building out the HAMR, and the other people that built the plugins and the exploits for it, right? So I find it really difficult to associate those two things, right? With the it's difficult to do this in a non-technical way, right? And I'm really trying hard to do that.
Appreciate that.
But it's just difficult to me, right, to see how someone would be able to use that in a non-attributable way if the only people that had it were the CIA, right? So WikiLeaks happens, and all of the plugins that you would need if you owned HAMR, you now have all of the plugins exposed on the internet, right?
WikiLeaks actually released them, huh?
WikiLeaks released them.
So anybody could use it. That's kind of dangerous, isn't it? It's like open the door to an ammunition dump.
It's dangerous, but now the person who has HAMR could use those and avoid attribution when the CIA was the only ones that had owned it before. Does that make sense?
Right, but Patrick, but this WikiLeaks Vault 7 thing, this wasn't announced until 2017, and Flynn was already, down the drain by then. So I come back to the very pertinent question: could decade-old? Sorry.
I'm real quick. They're not going to necessarily announce it right when it happened. I would actually suspect that those tools were actually hacked or stolen, probably in 2016.
Okay, but even so,
if the information was released in 17.
But the hacking of Trump and the Trump campaign and listening to these phone calls and the leaking of the phone calls, that all happened in 2016. So could 10-year-old technology, I mean, would it be able to break the encryption of whatever it is that they're doing with Trump and all that? I mean,
Was the Vault 7, was all the Vault 7 10-year-old technology? I don't believe it was, right?
I'm talking about the HAMR, the time that Montgomery was using it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the HAMR is, again, if I'm right about this, the HAMR is a platform like Kali Linux. And plugins are constantly being updated and added to Kali Linux to be able to allow you to do exploits. So I wouldn't look at it like, well, this was built back in 2010 and not have updated plugins and whatnot to be able to access people's stuff in 2014, 15, 16, 17. But if you use those exploits in 2016 and the only people that owned them were the CIA, then people would look straight at the CIA. But being that those were actually released, and if they were released or if it was made public in 2017, it was released at least 6 months prior to that. I would say probably closer to a year. They're going to investigate it. The FBI is. They're going to try to patch. They're going to reach out to Microsoft and other organizations and say, hey, these are now public. You need to patch these before we publicly release that they were all stolen, right? So when did the actual hacking occur of the plugins and such that would be used for the HAMR, right? And why would you want to do so? Who benefits from the release of that? Well, if you worked for the CIA and wanted to be able to use them and not have attribution to them, that would be a great way to do it. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I'm going to listen to this again because we've been talking about a lot of stuff, and I think there's a lot of information flying around. I want to thank you, Patrick, because this is exactly what I wanted to ask you. And, we're not necessarily finding the answers on today's call, but you've provided a lot of information that I think people will find useful. It's interesting, that the main takeaway that I've got in terms of what I wanted to know from you, if you had told me, there's no way that any other system could have been used to do this, it's got to be this HAMR, that would have really validated some of the claims of Mary Fanning. But it sounds like, in direct contrast to that, you're saying that although there are aspects of the HAMR as it's described that seem to fit the description of what was used, it doesn't really make sense that this would be the tool that they would use, and there seems to be a strong motive from Jim Jones, Michael Hayden, and others who would have access to Dynology and ClearForce or other similar systems to hide that by blaming it on something like this HAMR and Dennis Montgomery.
It makes sense. I have no idea. Right. I know what I know. I know the people that I worked for. I know what I did. I know the contracts I worked. I know how these relationships behave. I know how technology is developed, and then IP, intellectual property, made commercial. I agree with all of these things. So to that extent, extremely plausible. But when I look at it as to some of the claims or why you would choose that over the other, or perhaps maybe it's just like a prime sub relationship, right, where Jones is the prime and the HAMR is the sub, right, and the prime and the sub might not communicate much with each other, if any, to reduce plausible deniability, but the HAMR alone isn't going to do exactly what they've described alone, right? Based on everything that I've read, and based on, and like I said, I would love to have this conversation. I'm hoping to get some feedback from some people to say, hey, I think you're completely wrong here, or hey, you're close here, but have you thought about this? And that's what Crowdsource Truth is about, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So there you go.
I have one
Right,
final
what
question
that's
for you, Patrick, and then we're going to wrap it up. Someone is asking, if you built a harbor in 2002 and the last time it was utilized was 2010, would it still be viable to penetrate firewalls in 2016? I think he means if you built a tool in 2010 and the last time it was in 2002 and the last time it was utilized was 2010, would it still be viable to penetrate firewalls in 2016, or did encryption change sufficiently to make that obsolete as a penetration tool?
Good question, right? So it depends on what country. Iran,
United States,
China.
where Trump was.
Let me give you an example, though. Iran, China, Russia, right? Most of the users that have Windows 10 or any other Windows-based computer in those countries do not have the licensed versions of them, right? So they don't get their software updated. They all the vulnerabilities remain. So yes, an exploit from 2000 could easily attack a system in one of those countries where the vast majority of the users, it could be effective in that country where the vast majority of users
haven't upgraded to current.
Haven't upgraded and don't get the vulnerabilities covered, right?
But it's likely that Trump's Tower and things like that have very good IT people who are keeping them pretty tight.
Exactly. So is it going to have the same effect? Are you going to be able to get into Trump Tower in 2010 using a 2002 exploit? Not likely. Right? So It just depends. But there are places, maybe let's use percentages, maybe 5 to 10% of computers in 2010 have not patched vulnerabilities that an exploit from 2002 was designed to exploit the vulnerability of.
But it would rely on lax security on the target's part.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, which will be unlicensed software and such.
Yeah, and just to further clarify, some people are saying that I'm speculating that the HAMR wasn't used. The purpose of my question was to evoke an answer from you, positive or negative. Have we seen sufficient evidence that indicates, as alleged by Mary Fanning, that we've got solid evidence that the HAMR was used? And I think I've heard you say we haven't seen that evidence. It's actually more plausible that something other than the HAMR was used. And even if the HAMR was used, there's a possibility that something else could have been used as well, in addition to, instead of. We have no definitive evidence that it was definitely the HAMR that spied on Trump and Flynn.
No, not at all. It's a great conversation to have, though. And it educates people and informs people. And you don't just assume that only one application is going to be used here. These people partner. They have prime sub relationships. Why would Obama's director of DNI not have a relationship with Obama's national security advisor?
He would.
Obama's head of the CIA. Of course he would. Right? So, and all of these people, I actually look, when you're looking for like an archetypal figure, you generally look for the people that you don't see.
Right. That's what I'm getting at.
So I see so much of these other guys, and I see nothing of Jones. Exactly. And I see very little of Hayden, although Hayden's out more. But when have you seen Jones involved in any of this? Yet he has the most absolute direct connections, and I actually literally have emails from his son which would absolutely show the moral and ethical bankruptcy of these people, and whether or not they would actually use a weapon like this for malicious purposes, right? So certainly everybody has the ability to do. Real quick, right? You mentioned something on my Patreon site that I posted the other day about that Asian girl, right?
Yes.
That's a good example. Everybody has the ability to do absolutely devastating things. That psychopathic woman was able to get a guy to kill himself, and it only required 72,000 text messages, give or take a few thousand, right?
Why did she do that?
That's the way I see it. But why she did it is because of just pure malevolence, evil.
Wow.
But she has that ability, right? And she had the ability. She doesn't need. You don't need these super powerful AI computers and access to this or that to be able to do tremendous damage. People have the ability, psychopaths like her, have the ability to do their own analytics and find their own targets, which are going to be susceptible for them to influence. And she killed this guy.
Wow.
Flat out, pure malice, pure evil, pure malevolence. But she didn't require ClearForce or any of these companies to do that, right? So how many text messages is it going to take for someone like her, an individual like her, or a company like ClearForce, for example, to get some kid to walk into his school and start shooting up the school? How many text messages does that require? Right?
I don't know. But this is social engineering. They could have hired this woman to target this guy if he's somebody important.
They could have, but they wouldn't need to, because everything that she needed was available to her right at her fingertips with the technologies that we have today. Now, combine that with artificial intelligence and multi-million-dollar budgets, and think of what malevolence you would be capable of, right? It's on a whole nother scale. But still, one individual had the power to do that. That one individual, there is a number, there is an amount of text messages that would actually be required to get the right target to walk into a school and start shooting it up. There is a number for that. We don't know what that number is. Is it 80,000? Is it 150? Is it a better target with only 20,000 text messages or social media connections, right?
Yeah. Well, depending on what they're saying. Yeah.
Of it, and there would be no attribution to it.
Right.
This girl got caught because she did nothing for attribution, but if I wanted to attribute it to somebody else, like you said, if I wanted to influence that girl to do something like this, I could have done that.
So you want to kill the guy and you influence the girl to do it so it looks like you have nothing to do with it. That's exactly what I'm saying about this HAMR story. Somebody else did it, and they're blaming it on this guy over here. Well, Patrick, I want to thank you again. It's been a fascinating conversation, and even though you did not confirm all of my suspicions, you've given us some valuable information, and I did not bring you here to confirm what I said. I invited you to join us to give us your expert interpretation of these disparate pieces of information. I really appreciate you doing that. People who want to hear more about this psychotic social engineering of this woman in South Korea should get over to patreon.com/theshadownet hacker. People, I hope, will also do that to support Patrick in his ongoing efforts to reveal the ShadowNet and all of the shenanigans of the deep state. Patrick has been a victim of the deep state. He's a friend of the show, and he's been providing us with some really excellent, top-rate technical insights. Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today. I will be back at 5 o'clock. Charles Ortel is reinstating Closing In. So at 5 p.m. today, don't miss Charles Ortel. Patrick, thanks so much for joining me. I'll speak with you very soon.
Thank you.
Take care.